In the Hürtgen Forest, where snow lay thick and tree trunks exploded like spears raining down from the sky, 33,000 Americans fell. They won no glory, seized no territory on the map, but they held fast in spirit, turning defeat into victory, turning hell itself into an immortal witness to courage. The autumn wind swept through the ruined streets of Ardennes, the first German city to fall into Allied hands, sounding like history whispering across broken walls. The houses lay shattered, church domes collapsed, the streets still heavy with the stench of death. Yet, within the hearts of the American soldiers standing there, a bright conviction burned. At last, they had a chance to help bring this endless war to an end. On a small square, a group of US infantrymen sat leaning against a ruined wall, hands wrapped around steaming cups of coffee just brought forward by supply. The rising vapor mixed with the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air. Private Miller, a 19-year-old from Ohio, raised his cup to his lips and drew in a deep breath as if it were the scent of home. He glanced at Corporal Harris, the older man beside him, and asked softly, "How long do you think until we reach Berlin?" Harris smiled, a tired edge in his grin. "If you listen to the generals, we'll be eating turkey in the German capital by Christmas. But me, I think it's going to be a long haul." Miller frowned. In his mind, Berlin was a shining finish line, the picture of the Reichstag he'd once seen in a hometown newspaper. He imagined that day, tens of thousands of Americans cheering as the stars and stripes waved over German soil. But the brief joy quickly gave way to tense silence when new orders came down. General Collins, along with Bradley and Hodges, had just mapped out the next phase. To advance deeper, the Americans had to seize the Ruhr River dams, and to reach them, they would have to pass through 11 miles of thick, forbidding woods. The Hürtgen Forest. On the field table, the map glowed under a yellow lamp, showing a dark green block on the German-Belgian border. A young officer staring at it shivered and blurted out, "This isn't an avenue of advance. It's a graveyard." But there was no other choice. To swing around the Hürtgen meant leaving their flank exposed to German attacks. The cost then could be 100 times worse. On the first day of the march, Miller and his company moved in single file down a narrow dirt track. On both sides towered fir trees, their branches blotting out the sky. Daylight filtered down only in pale fragments, like the ghost of a moon. Mist hung heavy, damp cold, seeping into every joint. Each step sank into mud, with a sound like the earth itself groaning. Behind them, a jeep engine growled, straining to get through the mire, only to bog down until 4 or 5 men heaved it free. A hulking Sherman tank tried to cut a path through the trees, but managed only a few yards before a fallen trunk barred the way. The commander cursed and ordered it turned back. In this shadowed forest, the Americans' mechanized strength meant nothing. Private Miller leaned toward Harris and whispered, "What kind of forest is this? Feels like hell itself." Harris tightened his sling and answered flatly, "Hell or heaven, orders are orders." They pushed on, but everyone felt the weight of something unseen waiting up ahead. Moments later, their fears became real. German fire erupted. From a pillbox camouflaged under branches, an MG-42 tore the silence apart, bullets slicing the air overhead, forcing the platoon to hit the ground and scramble for cover. Lieutenant Johnson, their platoon leader, bellowed into the fog, "Form up! Push forward! Flush them out!" Grenade pins snapped, the lead squad hurling them into the nest. Explosions shook the ground, dirt and rock showering down. The men surged forward, M1 Garands firing shot after shot. At last, the MG-42 went silent. They had the bunker, but 3 of their own lay dead in the trees. Miller bent over the body of Private Young, the same boy who had shared a cigarette with him on the way to Ardennes. Now Young's eyes were wide open, staring into the mist as if trapped between worlds. Hands trembling, Miller closed them and whispered, We'll carry on for you." For the first time, Miller understood the real face of combat, the kind no training exercise could ever capture. This forest would claim countless lives, and yet he and the others had no choice but to keep moving forward. Night came fast in the Hürtgen. The Americans dug foxholes and stretched ponchos against the rain. Breath smoked white in the air. In the dark, the sound of saws, shovels, and murmured talk blended into a mournful rhythm. Corporal Harris handed Miller half a chocolate bar left in his pocket. "Eat up. Tomorrow's going to be long." Miller took it, bit down, the sweetness mingling with the taste of dirt and smoke. He looked up through the trees, searching for a break in the canopy to glimpse the sky, but saw only blackness tangled with branches. In his heart, he thought of the letter he hadn't yet written to his mother. He wanted to say, "I'm fine. We're getting closer to victory," but he knew the truth. Tomorrow, no one could be sure of being alive. The next day, the Americans pushed forward a few hundred more yards. Every yard was paid for with sweat, blood, and lives. They stumbled into mines, barbed wire, timber traps, and countless firing positions disguised with terrifying skill by the enemy. There were times when an entire company was reduced by half in a single morning, yet no one ran. Not a single man stepped back. They knew that if they stopped, the whole campaign would fail. One afternoon, in a rare moment of quiet, Chaplain Daniel read lines from the Bible beside the wounded. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The soldiers sat in silence, eyes wet, gripping their rifles as if they were gripping their very lives. They didn't know if they would ever see home again, but they knew this: today's sacrifice would open the way for tomorrow's peace. In a meeting with his junior officers, General Collins spoke bluntly. "I know many of us want to get out of this forest right now. But if we bypass it, the Germans will hit our flank. The whole campaign will collapse. We cannot let that happen." That message, carried by radio, reached down to every company. It wasn't wrapped in stirring rhetoric, just raw truth. And it was that truth which made the Americans tighten their ranks and advance into the firestorm. Private Miller would later write in his diary, "Every time a man went down, we stepped forward. There were moments I was paralyzed with fear, but when I looked at Harris, at Lieutenant Johnson, I realized this was my new family. We fought for each other, because of each other. This forest wanted to swallow us whole, but we would conquer it, with sweat, with blood, and with a will that could not be broken." In the pitch-black night, beneath towering trees, those young men entered a journey that history would call the Green Hell. But to them, it was more than hell. It was the place that proved the worth of brotherhood, of courage, and of a single belief: that freedom always demanded sacrifice. The rain in the Hürtgen was unlike any rain those American boys had ever known. It fell without pause, heavy as an iron curtain, cold enough to pierce straight through their soaked wool coats. Every morning, soldiers scraped mud from their boots before moving out. Within hours, the muck caked on again. Lieutenant Johnson's platoon trudged along a narrow path, hemmed in by walls of fir trees, their branches sharp as spears. The ground beneath was a slurry of mud, rainwater carving little channels that carried fallen leaves downstream. Overhead, a grey mist coiled and rolled, swallowing the daylight. Private Miller pulled his collar high, breath puffing white into the air. Beside him, Harris muttered, "Hell's bells! Feels like we're walking into the belly of some giant beast." Miller said nothing. In his mind, the Hürtgen Forest truly felt alive, its trunks like ribs, its canopy like flesh, and the whispering wind all around like the sound of breathing. Suddenly, crack! A man up ahead dropped. Dirt exploded around him. A German machine gun ripped through the woods. The platoon did what it had done for days. Hit the ground, scrambling for cover. "Comms! Report the coordinates!" Johnson shouted. It was useless. Radio signals died in the forest. smothered by fog and trees. No air support, no artillery fire. They were completely on their own. Harris crawled close, gripping Miller's shoulder. "Do you see anything?" Miller squinted through the leaves. All he saw was a wall of green, no sign of a man. But the gun kept firing, bursts tearing the silence apart. Bullets chewed into tree trunks, splinters raining down like knives. "Nothing!" Miller yelled back. Johnson's jaw clenched. He barked, "2 men swing left, I'll take B squad right." Force them out. The Americans split into small teams. Miller and Harris crawled through the rotting leaves, the stink of mold heavy in their noses. Mud soaked through their clothes, chilling them to the bone. Their hearts pounded as they crept closer. At the base of a massive tree, Harris raised his hand in signal. Ahead lay a camouflaged mound of earth. Through the mesh of leaves, a glint of metal flashed, the barrel of an MG-42. Harris thought grimly, "Got you!" Miller yanked the pin from a grenade, counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, and hurled it. The grenade rolled inside. A sharp blast split the forest. The machine gun went silent. They charged. Rifles cracked. When the smoke cleared, 3 Germans lay sprawled, their weapons scattered. Miller stood gasping, heart hammering like it might burst out of his chest. Harris clapped his shoulder and said quietly, "Good job, kid. But don't let your guard down. God only knows what else is waiting for us." In the Hürtgen, the enemy was not only flesh and blood. Nature itself was just as merciless as the Germans. One morning, as the platoon climbed a slope, the sky suddenly shook. German artillery hammered the treetops. The shells didn't explode on the ground. They burst high above, sending jagged wooden shards from shattered trunks raining down like a storm of blades. Miller threw his arms over his head, feeling splinters stab into the earth beside him. A soldier only a few yards away collapsed, his chest pierced by a timber shard as thick as a spear. Blood mixed with rain, spreading red through the mud. "Watch the wood fragments!" someone screamed, voice breaking with desperation. Harris yanked Miller into a rocky hollow, the two of them pressed tight together. Explosions thundered in succession, leaves falling like a storm. When the barrage ended, the ground looked like a graveyard. Not only bodies, but trunks cleaved in half, jagged branches jutting into the earth like giant spears. Miller trembled, whispering, "Oh God." Harris said nothing, his eyes dark. He wasn't surprised to see Miller shaking. Fear crept into every man. But they still had to move forward. In rare moments of rest, they leaned against one another, breaking hard rations tough as stone. A few forced out laughter, telling stories of home to drown out the echo of blasts still rattling in their heads. Private Miller remembered the day he first got the news he'd been drafted. His mother had wept, while his father said only one thing. "Son, remember, Americans never quit." We can always find a way through. Those words echoed in his mind, a small flame that kept him standing in the darkness. Once, their unit was trapped 3 days in a narrow valley. Ammunition dwindled. Resupply couldn't get through. Rain poured without pause. Foxholes filled with water. Soldiers shivering in soaked uniforms. But no one abandoned their position. Lieutenant Johnson walked the trench line, boots sinking in mud, voice hoarse but firm. "I know you're tired. I know you're cold, but look around. We're standing here for thousands of our brothers behind us. If we pull back, they die. If we hold, they live." Those words, plain and simple, sank into every heart. That night, Miller sat clutching his rifle, rain lashing his face, yet in his eyes burned a strange pride. The battle for the Hürtgen Forest was not about swift thrusts or resounding victories. It was a grind, yards of ground paid for in blood. But it was in the darkest place that the light of American courage shone brightest. They knew the cost. They knew this path offered no instant glory, yet they pressed on, because behind them were comrades, brothers, parents, and the very ideal of freedom itself. In the diary of an American officer later found after the battle was written, "The Hürtgen Forest gave us nothing but blood and tears." But it gave the world this truth, that the American soldier, even in hell, does not break. On a freezing night in late October, the first snow blanketed the forest white. Johnson's platoon lit a small fire in a dugout, shielded by tattered coats. Harris passed Miller half a cigarette. "Tomorrow we fight together again, right?" Miller looked up at the flakes drifting through the night and answered softly, "Of course, my brother." In that moment, both understood. The road home was far away, but even if nothing lay ahead but darkness, they would keep walking, because they were American soldiers. At dawn, fog cloaked the Hürtgen in grey and white. Frost clung to branches, the forest like a frozen shroud. From within the mist, the heavy footsteps of the 22nd Regiment echoed. They pushed forward a few hundred more yards, then stopped, because everywhere ahead lay hidden gun nests, mines, and coils of barbed wire. In just 20 days, that regiment paid a terrible price. From an original strength of over 3,000 men, fewer than 2,000 remained. Each time company officers read the roll, their voices caught, pausing for a moment before pressing on. Then came the order, "Advance!" and the soldiers shouldered their packs once again. Private Miller felt the change all around him. On the first day in the forest, they'd been a full unit, with laughter and stories of home. Now the platoon was half its size, but in the eyes of those who remained burned something steely, like iron tempered in fire. One afternoon, after securing a stretch of trail, Miller slumped against a tree, blood seeping through his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. Harris sat beside him, lighting a cigarette. He held it out. "Here, take a drag." Forget the pain, Miller accepted, drew in the smoke. It stung his eyes, mingling with the mist. He murmured, "Don't you think we're paying too high a price?" Harris was silent for a long while before answering, "Every yard we take keeps tens of thousands behind us safe. Too high? Maybe. But even so, I'd still keep going." Miller nodded. Deep down, he knew his friend was right. During those days, many war correspondents came to the Hürtgen, including Ernest Hemingway. He didn't hide his bitterness. Sitting in a dugout beside Colonel Lanham, Hemingway said, "Instead of sending these boys into the forest, they might as well have shot them as they stepped off the trucks." The remark made some officers scowl, but Lanham stayed silent. He knew Hemingway meant no insult, only sorrow. No matter what, his men still had to march forward. On November 20th, 1944, the 22nd Regiment had advanced 4 more miles, at the cost of over 1,000 casualties. Estimates said, for every 10 yards of ground, 1 or 2 American soldiers fell. Yet no one called it defeat. On the contrary, it became a symbol. In a brief memorial service, held right on the battlefield, Chaplain Daniel stood in the middle of a circle of soldiers, his deep, steady voice carrying over the mud and smoke. "Brothers, we have all lost much, but look around you. If we had not advanced, the Germans would have broken through. We hold here not only for ourselves, but as a shield for the entire front. Remember this, your sacrifice is not in vain." A heavy silence followed. Then, one by one, the soldiers placed their hands over their hearts. In that moment, they were no longer just lonely figures in a vast, endless forest. They became the very embodiment of the American spirit, the will to stand firm against any hell. In the days that followed, both nature and the enemy continued to test them. The nights were bitter cold, foxholes filled with water. At times, men had to sleep sitting upright, rifles clutched to their chests, afraid that if they set them down, the weapons would be caked in mud and useless by morning. Private Miller remembered one night in particular. The unit was under savage shelling, the sky lit by fierce flashes. When the barrage eased, he heard the moans of a newly arrived replacement, Private Thompson. The boy was gravely wounded, his uniform soaked completely in red. Miller crawled over and grasped his hand. "Hold on." "You'll be all right," Thompson whispered through cracked lips. "Tell my mother I didn't run." Miller squeezed his hand tighter, pride and sorrow welling inside him. Here was the unyielding spirit of a boy barely out of school, now falling with the courage of a hero. The next day, when the platoon assembled, Lieutenant Johnson spoke briefly. "We lost 12 more men yesterday, but we're still here, and as long as one of us is still standing, we'll fight for all those who've fallen." There were no cheers, but every head nodded. In their eyes burned the fire of resolve. When the advance paused to regroup, Miller wrote in his journal, "We don't win every battle, but we don't lose in spirit. Every time we fall, we rise again. This forest may swallow our bodies, but it will never consume our will." Those lines, scribbled in pencil with a trembling hand in the dark, would later be found and serve as living proof of their endurance. Harris, who had once scoffed when they first entered the forest, had changed too. In a rare conversation by a small fire, he told Miller, "You know, I used to think this fight was pointless. But looking at every man who's gone down, I get it now. The meaning is in the sacrifice. Because of them, we're one step closer to peace. Because of them, the road to Berlin is still open." Miller gave a quiet nod. As November dragged on, the Hürtgen still hadn't fallen to the Americans, but the spirit they left behind resounded. Even General Collins admitted, "My men don't want to fight in this cursed place." But they have, and they've stood firm. Even in hell, rain never stopped falling in the Hürtgen. Streams in the ravines swelled high, their icy water carrying yellow leaves and tatters of ruined uniforms. In the smoke and fire of this inferno, life and death often hung by a single breath. And then, in the darkest of days, came an astonishing moment that silenced both sides. A strange ceasefire. On the morning of December 7th, 1944, mist still blanketed the Kal ravine. Private Miller was on guard duty when he noticed a pale scrap of cloth fluttering faintly through the rain. At first, he thought it was just a shred caught in the branches, but seconds later, he realized it was a small white flag trembling in the wind. He raised the alarm. Lieutenant Johnson rushed out, eyes tense. Across the line, a German soldier slowly emerged from his foxhole, hands raised. His grey coat was drenched, water streaming from the rim of his helmet. Behind him came a German officer, a red armband with a cross on his chest. He lifted a hand and shouted in broken English, "Doctor!" "I am a doctor." His voice was raw, pleading. He pushed on, each word breaking apart in the rain. "Wounded. Many. Both sides. Please. Ceasefire. Take them out." The Americans immediately raised their rifles. Miller's hands shook as he leveled his sights on the German officer. Rage swelled in him. The man before him belonged to the army that had cut down his friends only yesterday. But in the German doctor's eyes, there was no hate, only exhaustion, and a fierce determination to save lives. Johnson frowned. He knew he was facing an impossible choice. One mistake, and his men could be walking straight into a trap. Yet he also heard the moans of the wounded behind him. Americans and Germans alike. A minute of heavy silence passed. Then at last, Johnson lowered his hand. He signaled his men to lower their rifles and said firmly, "1 hour. Only 1 hour. After that, you're on your own." The German officer bowed deeply, a gesture of gratitude. For 1 hour, the Hürtgen Forest fell into a strange, solemn stillness. The guns were silent. Only the rain and the wind remained. American and German soldiers alike climbed out of their foxholes, unarmed. They walked toward each other, wary steps, but no hatred in their eyes. Before them lay a field of bodies and wounded scattered across the mud, some groaning, others already still and cold. Private Miller and Harris carried an American soldier badly wounded in the leg. The white bandage was already soaked through with dark red. When they set the stretcher down, a German soldier bent over. quickly cutting strips of cloth with his knife to tighten the wound. Miller froze for a second, then gave a faint nod of thanks. The German said nothing, just nodded back, his deep blue eyes filled with exhaustion. Nearby, a young German soldier was carried out, his face pale. An American GI pulled out a Lucky Strike, lit it, and handed it to him. The boy's hands trembled as he drew in a breath, smoke mixing with the cold air. He gave a faint, tired smile. Those small gestures in that fleeting hour made both sides see each other differently. All of them were simply sons far from home, husbands, fathers, thrown into history's meat grinder. Chaplain Daniel stepped forward, holding a small wooden cross. He stood among the stretcher bearers, his voice rising steady and warm through the rain. Lord, have mercy on the souls who have fallen. Ease the suffering of those still living, and let us remember, before we were enemies, we were all your children. Something remarkable happened. Both American and German soldiers bowed their heads. The hatred was gone. What remained were men yearning for peace, sharing, for a rare moment, the same prayer. Harris stood next to Miller and whispered, "This is crazy. Yesterday, we were killing each other. Today, we're praying together." Miller answered, his voice unsteady, "Maybe that's exactly what makes it worth remembering." As the evacuation went on, quiet exchanges drifted through the mist. One young American, speaking halting German, asked a wounded boy of 17, "How old are you?" 17. The American sighed. "I was 17 too when I enlisted." They looked at each other, saying nothing more. But in that silence lived 1,000 unspoken stories. Elsewhere, an older German soldier whispered to Harris through a translator, "I once had a small shop in Cologne." Now, there's nothing left. Harris thought of his father's grocery back in Ohio. He didn't answer, but inside he felt something strange. Maybe, if not for this war, they could have met as friends. An hour slipped away like a blink. When the signal whistle blew, both sides stopped what they were doing. Americans and Germans slowly returned to their foxholes. No handshakes, no promises. But the looks they exchanged said it all. "I understand you, but we must go on." The next day, the guns thundered again. Fire and smoke swallowed the forest. The brief flame of humanity was smothered by the merciless churn of war. That night, in their dugout, Miller said softly to Harris, "Did you see their eyes? Just like ours. Tired, scared, but still holding a rifle." Harris sighed. "If we'd met under different circumstances, maybe we'd be friends. But this is war, and war doesn't let friendship last." Miller said nothing more, but inside him, the memory of that morning cut deep, like a knife carved into wood. He realized that the sacrifices of his comrades weren't only about killing the enemy, but about making sure that someday humanity wouldn't have to meet each other down the barrel of a gun. The winter of 1944 crashed down on the Hürtgen like a merciless beast. Snow fell heavy, covering foxholes and turning them into cold tombs. Wind tore through the ravines, howling like the cries of the fallen. The sky stayed dark day after day, as if even the sun was afraid to shine on this place. Young soldiers from the warm farmlands of Texas, the coasts of California, or the fields of Florida had never known such skin-splitting cold. Boots mired in mud froze stiff, every step stabbing like knives. Many began to suffer frostbite, fingers too numb to squeeze a trigger, yet they still had to stand watch, rifles clutched tight, eyes fixed on the fog ahead. Private Miller never forgot one blizzard night. The wind screamed, snow lashed their faces raw. He and Harris took turns brushing snow off their rifles, afraid the weapons would freeze solid, nothing more than lumps of iron. In the dugout, a small fire flickered, smoke stinging their eyes. Some of the younger men groaned, shivering uncontrollably. Carter, the soldier who once sang loudly on the march, now lay curled up, lips blue. Harris pulled off his own coat, laying it over Carter's body, rasping out, "Stay warm, kid. We're not leaving you here." Carter's lips moved, but no words came. Miller watched, heart aching. He understood. In this forest, the enemy wasn't only the Germans, it was the cold itself. The next morning, before the sky had fully lightened, German artillery struck again. Tree after tree exploded, jagged splinters stabbing down into foxholes. A soldier named Robinson was hit in the shoulder, blood staining white snow crimson. He clenched his jaw, never uttering a cry. His comrades rushed to bandage him, but Robinson shook his head. "Don't worry about me." "Keep moving." He pushed himself up, still gripping his rifle, forcing his body to stand, to prove he wasn't finished. That image burned into Miller's memory. A soldier trembling from blood loss, yet his eyes shone bright, like a torch against the winter dark. In the days that followed, the ranks thinned even further. Some companies were reduced to fewer than 10 men, and yet, strangely, their spirit never broke. On the contrary, the harsher it became, the tighter they bound themselves together. One evening, with snow piled deep, Harris handed Miller half a cracker. "Eat. Who knows if we'll have anything tomorrow?" Miller looked at him, his eyes blurred by the firelight. They didn't need many words. In war, sharing a crumb of bread, a cigarette, a blanket, that was the most sacred form of brotherhood. Many of them would never be named in battlefield reports. No medals, no grand speeches. They simply fell in silence, their blood seeping into the snow. But it was those silent men who held the line, yard by yard, trail by trail, so that the armies behind them would not be cut to pieces. Chaplain Daniel wrote in his journal, "I see nameless heroes every day. They die without bugles, without medals. They die with rifles still in their hands, eyes still fixed forward. If there is a heaven, surely God will welcome them gladly." One morning, Miller and a few others were ordered to scout a narrow road. They moved quietly, eyes straining at every bush. Then, suddenly, a mine exploded. The blast tore the air apart, dirt and stone flying everywhere. Howard, the strongest man in the platoon, was thrown yards away. When Miller and Harris reached him, his legs were mangled beyond saving. Howard was still conscious, sweat pouring down, but his eyes blazed bright. He gripped Miller's hand, voice shaking. "Don't stop for me. Keep moving." Miller shook his head, tears spilling. "We're not leaving you." Howard forced a smile. "If I don't make it, tell my wife. I fought till the end for them." An hour later, Howard breathed his last. In the arms of his comrades, his face was calm, as if in sleep. Miller never forgot that feeling, pain and pride fused into one. That night, as the snow fell thick, Harris whispered to Miller, "You know, it's men like Howard who are the backbone of the army. Not the generals, not the strategies. It's them, the ordinary ones, who keep the world from falling apart." Miller nodded. A deep respect welled inside him. He knew that if he himself were to fall tomorrow, he too wanted to be remembered that way. An ordinary soldier, but one who never quit. Day by day, the platoon was reduced to a third of its strength, but not a single man withdrew. They clung to every foxhole, every tree trunk. They knew their sacrifice was the shield for tens of thousands behind them. In a report sent back to headquarters, Lieutenant Johnson wrote, "We don't have many men left, but the ones who remain, I swear, they will stand until their last breath. These are nameless heroes, and they deserve every word of praise." Each time Chaplain Daniel watched another soldier fall, he spoke a short prayer. "God will remember your name, even if the world forgets." And the living tightened their grip on their rifles and pressed on. December dragged on, the toll rising to monstrous levels. Hundreds of Americans died from cold, sickness, exhaustion, not to mention shells and machine guns. Yet, the line still held. Each time the alarm sounded, weary silhouettes rose from the snow, rifles leveled forward. One American officer later wrote, "They were never named in the newspapers. They never wore shining medals. But it was they, the nameless heroes who kept the US Army from breaking in the hell of Hürtgen. The new year of 1945 arrived, but the Hürtgen remained buried beneath a heavy white shroud, so quiet it was eerie, as if nature itself wanted to hide all traces of war. Beneath the frozen ground lay tens of thousands of American and German bodies, locked in eternal silence. No more songs, no more roaring fire, only a heavy emptiness. And in that silence, the Americans were forced to withdraw from the forest. They left behind 33,000 casualties, a staggering number, one that made many call Hürtgen the bloodiest defeat on the Western Front. The young faces were gone. The laughter from Ohio, Texas, or New York now lingering only in the memories of those who survived. As Private Miller left the forest, he looked back one last time. The towering trees stood like cold monuments. A painful question rose in his heart. Was all that sacrifice worth it? Harris walked beside him, his cloak in tatters, his face gaunt, but his eyes still burning bright. He murmured, as if reading Miller's thoughts, "No sacrifice is ever meaningless." Miller stayed silent. He knew Harris was right, but his heart was still heavy. They had left behind too many brothers: Carter, Robinson, Peterson, Howard. Those names now lived only in memory. Every yard in the Hürtgen had been paid for in blood, and in the end, the Americans could not hold it. On the surface, it was an undeniable defeat. But history isn't measured only in maps or miles gained. It is measured in consequences, in opportunities carved out by sacrifice. During the weeks the Americans were tied down in Hürtgen, the Germans had poured everything into holding the forest. Divisions that could have reinforced other fronts were pinned in the green hell. So when Hitler prepared to launch his desperate counterstroke in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the German army was already weakened. The deaths in Hürtgen, seemingly pointless, had in fact bought precious time. Time for the Allies to regroup, to strengthen, and to block the Third Reich's final blow. Without the grinding battle in Hürtgen, the Ardennes might have become a catastrophe for the Allies. When Johnson's platoon pulled out of the forest, fewer than a quarter of its men remained. Lieutenant Johnson lay on a stretcher, his wounds still raw, but his eyes resolute. He whispered to Harris and Miller, "Never think you've lost. It's because of you that the Germans no longer had the strength to beat us at Ardennes. That is victory of the spirit." Miller glanced at Harris. Both of them were exhausted, bodies torn and battered, but a strange pride stirred inside. They understood now. Their fallen comrades had not died in vain. Historians would argue endlessly about Hürtgen. Some called it a tragedy, others a bloody lesson in modern war. But all agreed on one thing. The spirit of the American soldier here had gone beyond all limits. An American officer wrote in his memoir, "Hürtgen gave us no glory, but it gave us the truth. The American soldier will never retreat, even knowing the price is death." To history, the Hürtgen Forest was not only a defeat, it was proof that courage could turn failure into another kind of victory, a victory of will. As the trucks carried the survivors away, snow still fell. Miller leaned his forehead against the window and closed his eyes. In the wind, he thought he heard Carter's Christmas songs, Robinson's laughter, and Peterson's last words. He knew they were gone, but it was their sacrifice that had pinned the Germans, that had opened the road to later victory. For many, Hürtgen was a defeat, but for Miller, for Harris, for all who had survived it, Hürtgen was a symbol that America could lose tens of thousands of men, but never lose its fighting spirit.